Walter Hughes sat in the corner of the dimly lit diner, staring at the menu with tired eyes. His hands trembled slightly, whether from age, hunger, or the weight of memories, even he wasn't sure. A decorated veteran, once strong and proud, now reduced to counting change for a cup of coffee. Across the room, Emily Carter, a waitress barely making ends meet, noticed him. She had seen struggling customers before, but something about this man, the quiet dignity, the exhaustion in his face, made her pause. She knew what it was like to fight battles no one else saw. What she did next was simple. A small act of kindness, unnoticed by most. But by the next morning, the entire country would know her name. Hi everyone, welcome to Life Diaries, incredible stories where kindness always comes full circle. Let's get started. The diner smelled of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon, a familiar scent that wrapped around Emily Carter like an old blanket. She had worked here for nearly a decade, moving swiftly between tables, refilling mugs, and offering tired smiles to weary travelers. The job wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on and put food on the table for her 8-year-old son. Tonight, however, something felt different. At a booth near the window, an elderly man sat hunched over, staring at the menu as if he were trying to will the prices lower. His uniform jacket, though clean, was worn at the edges, the faded patches barely clinging to the fabric. His right pant leg was neatly folded where his leg should have been, a stark reminder of sacrifices made long ago. Emily had seen veterans come and go before, but something about him, perhaps the way his fingers hovered over the cheapest item on the menu, or the way his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, made her pause. She watched as he carefully placed a few crumpled bills and coins onto the table, barely enough for a cup of coffee. When she walked over, he didn't look up, only murmured his order, his voice hoarse and tired. "Just the coffee, ma'am." His words were polite, but there was something else there too, pride, maybe, or the quiet resignation of a man who had learned to make do with less. Emily hesitated for only a second before making a decision. "You know," she said with a warm smile, "we've got a special tonight, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a slice of apple pie. My treat, if you'll let me." The old man stiffened. "I don't take charity," he muttered, eyes fixed on the table. "It's not charity," Emily said gently, setting down the coffee in front of him. "It's gratitude. My grandfather served too. Always said a warm meal could make all the difference after a long day." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a slow nod, he exhaled deeply, his fingers curling around the coffee mug as if drawing warmth from it. "All right," he finally said. "Just this once." As Emily turned toward the kitchen, she didn't notice the man in the corner booth lowering his phone after capturing the moment. Nor did she see him typing quickly, sending the story out into the world. By morning, that single act of kindness would have reached thousands. By the next day, it would reach millions. And soon, it would reach the president himself. The morning rush at the diner was always the same, coffee brewing, silverware clinking, voices blending into a low hum of conversation. Emily Carter had barely stepped onto the floor when her coworker, Lisa, waved her over with wide eyes, shoving a newspaper toward her. "You're in here," she whispered, jabbing at the front page. Emily blinked, confused, then glanced down. There, beneath a bold headline, was a picture of her placing a steaming plate of food in front of an elderly veteran. The article detailed the story of her simple act of kindness, how she had paid for his meal without hesitation, how she had taken a moment to listen when no one else had. She barely had time to process it before the phone at the hostess stand rang for the third time that morning. "They've been calling since we opened," Lisa murmured. "Reporters, radio stations. Everyone wants to talk to you." Emily shook her head, her heart pounding. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. It was just dinner. Just a conversation. But before she could say a word, the front door swung open, and in walked Walter Hughes, the same veteran she had helped, now looking overwhelmed as he took in the bustling diner. People were pointing, whispering. Someone stood to shake his hand. Someone else clapped him on the back, thanking him for his service. He looked at Emily, his face unreadable, and slowly made his way toward her. "You did this?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Emily swallowed, glancing at the paper in her hands. "I didn't mean for." "Doesn't matter," he interrupted, nodding toward the growing crowd. "People are listening. For the first time in a long time, they're listening." Before Emily could respond, Lisa gasped, grabbing her arm. "Oh my God!" She pointed toward the TV mounted in the corner of the diner, where the morning news played on mute. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she saw her own face on the screen, right beside a scrolling banner, "White House responds to viral story of waitress helping veteran." The phone rang again. This time, when Lisa answered, her face drained of color. She turned, pressing the receiver against her shoulder. "Emily," she whispered. "It's the White House. The president wants to speak with you." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she held the phone to her ear. The diner, once filled with the familiar clatter of dishes and low murmurs of conversation, had gone completely silent. Every eye was on her, every breath held in anticipation. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, and unmistakable. "Miss Carter, this is the President of the United States." Her breath hitched. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The president continued, his tone warm yet filled with an authority that sent a shiver down her spine. "I saw what you did for Mr. Hughes. I read the story, watched the footage, and I want to personally thank you. What you did wasn't just about paying for a meal. You reminded this country what it means to take care of those who've sacrificed for us." Emily's fingers tightened around the receiver, her mind racing. It had been a simple gesture. A meal, a few kind words. Nothing more. Yet somehow, that moment had grown into something bigger than she could have ever imagined. She glanced at Walter, who sat at the counter, his hands folded in his lap. His eyes, once filled with quiet resignation, now held something else, hope. The president's voice softened. "I want to invite you to the White House. I want the nation to hear your story. Not because of what you did, but because of what it represents." Emily felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't about her. It was about the countless veterans who had been forgotten, about the small acts of kindness that could ripple outward, changing lives in ways no one could predict. She swallowed hard, finally finding her voice. "Mr. President," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was just doing what anyone should do." There was a pause on the other end before he replied, his voice filled with conviction. "That's exactly why people need to hear it." As she slowly hung up the phone, the diner erupted into applause. Strangers smiled at her, some with tears in their eyes. Walter gave her a knowing nod, his hand gripping hers for just a moment before he turned away, blinking rapidly. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, but it wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, something powerful. For the first time in her life, Emily Carter realized that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of history. The day Emily Carter stepped into the White House, she still couldn't quite believe how her life had changed in less than a week. Just days ago, she had been wiping down tables, balancing bills, and making sure her son finished his homework before bedtime. Now, she was walking through the grand hallways of the most powerful building in the country, guided by an aide who spoke in hushed, respectful tones. Cameras flashed as she entered a room filled with officials, veterans, and journalists, all waiting for the moment when an ordinary waitress from a small-town diner would stand beside the President of the United States. When she saw Walter Hughes in the front row, sitting tall despite his missing leg, her nerves steadied. He looked different than when she first met him, his shoulders weren't hunched with the weight of being invisible, his eyes weren't shadowed with loneliness. The world had noticed him, and it had noticed all the others like him who had been quietly struggling for years. The president took the podium, his gaze scanning the room before settling on her. "We live in a world that moves fast, where people pass each other every day without a second glance. But kindness, real kindness, has the power to stop time. A single moment of compassion can remind someone that they are seen, that they are valued. Emily Carter didn't just buy a meal that night, she reminded a man who served his country that his sacrifices still mattered. And in doing so, she reminded us all. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Emily felt her throat tighten. She hadn't sought recognition. She hadn't expected any of this. But standing there, hearing the president speak, seeing Walter sitting among his fellow veterans, she realized this was no longer about her. It was about the message that had traveled across the nation, that a simple act of humanity could shake the world awake. When she finally stepped forward to speak, her hands were steady, her voice clear. "I'm no hero," she began, her gaze moving from the president to Walter to the crowd before her. "I'm just someone who saw another person in need and did what I could. But if this moment means anything, I hope it reminds people that no act of kindness is too small. That no one, especially those who've given so much, should ever feel forgotten." Applause erupted around her, but all she could hear was the faint sound of Walter exhaling, as if he had been holding his breath for years. She turned to him, and he nodded, a quiet acknowledgement, a shared understanding. The world had finally listened, and because of that, lives would change. As she walked out of the White House that afternoon, feeling the warm sun on her face, Emily knew her life would never be the same. But more importantly, she knew that neither would his. The night had been quiet in the small diner, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the bones of a place that had seen generations come and go. The overhead lights cast a warm glow onto the faded checkered floor, and the scent of coffee lingered in the air like an old friend. Emily Carter had been wiping down the counter, her mind occupied with the usual worries, rent, groceries, whether her son had finished his homework, when Walter Hughes had walked in. She had noticed him immediately, not because he demanded attention, but because of the way he carried himself. There was a weariness in his posture, a hesitation in the way he glanced at the menu, as if he were calculating how much he could afford without drawing attention to himself. She had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who had learned to go unnoticed. She hadn't planned on doing anything special that night. She had simply done what felt right, what her grandfather had taught her, that no one who had served this country should ever feel forgotten. The meal she placed in front of Walter had been more than just food, it had been a reminder that he still mattered. She hadn't expected anything to come from it. She certainly hadn't expected a stranger in the corner booth to take a picture, for that picture to spread across the country, or for the president himself to call her the next morning. But life had a way of turning the smallest moments into something far bigger than anyone could predict. When she stood in the White House days later, listening to the president speak about kindness and the power of human connection, she realized that this was never just about her. It was about Walter. It was about every veteran who had ever felt like they had been left behind. It was about reminding people that the simple act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, could change a life. As she spoke to the crowd, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, she wasn't thinking about cameras or headlines. She was thinking about the way Walter had looked at her that night in the diner, the quiet gratitude in his eyes, the way his hands had stopped shaking just for a moment as he held that warm cup of coffee. By the time she returned home, the world had already moved on to the next story, the next headline. But at the diner, things had changed. Strangers came in asking about Walter, offering a handshake, a meal, a conversation. The local Veterans Association reached out to him, helping him secure better housing and medical care. More than that, people seemed to look at each other differently, just a little longer, with a little more understanding. The ripple effect of one small act had stretched farther than she could have imagined. One evening, as she was closing up, the door swung open, and there stood Walter, a quiet smile on his face. He slid into his usual seat at the counter, and before he could ask, she poured him a cup of coffee, just the way he liked it. "It's on the house," she said, grinning. He shook his head, reaching into his pocket, but this time, it wasn't to count out change. He pulled out a small, carefully folded American flag, the fabric worn but well kept. He placed it on the counter and met her eyes. "This belonged to a friend of mine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He would have liked what you did. What you're still doing." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and took the flag with both hands, holding it as if it carried the weight of all the stories that had come before her. In that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. Kindness wasn't just about a single moment or a single meal. It was about showing up, again and again, for the people who needed it most. It was about remembering. As Walter took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle into his chest, Emily turned back to the quiet hum of the diner, knowing that this, right here, was where change truly began. In the end, Emily Carter's simple act of kindness did more than just feed a hungry veteran, it reignited a conversation about gratitude, respect, and the quiet struggles of those who have sacrificed for their country. What started as a warm meal in a small-town diner became a nationwide reminder that no gesture of compassion is ever too small. Walter Hughes, once invisible to the world, was given not only recognition but also a renewed sense of dignity and belonging. And Emily, an ordinary waitress with a kind heart, proved that the smallest actions can create waves that reach farther than we ever imagine. The lesson here is clear: we all have the power to make a difference. Sometimes, it takes nothing more than stopping for a moment, looking someone in the eye, and choosing to care. A single act of kindness can change a life, and in some cases, it can change the world. If you love inspiring stories about kindness and unexpected opportunities, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next powerful story.